the strike on Soissons was just as horrific as the strike on Valencia, bringing to bear the same horrors and scores of innocent dead. As such, the front against Germania suffered, and the Italians regained some land in the north. However, the Wotansloa initiated a push down out of the north, conquering Frisia outright, a land which was underdefended and complacent in a generally quiet North Sea. General Carcana rallied the military in 1967 and pursued a doctrine of total war, converting nearly all civilian industry to military means, turning fertilizer plants into explosive depots, cobblers into bootmakers, and mechanics into military engineers. There was little murmuring from the people, as they now lived beneath the terror of the atom bomb, and were more than willing to listen to the only man standing between them and annihilation. The Pact of Rome, which had sent yet another capitulation demand, was flabbergasted the Confederation of the Blood did not surrender. General Octavian Bartel of Italia, High Commander of the Allied Pact Western Forces, the man who was largely responsible for selecting targets and carrying out nuclear strikes against them, remarked, "For a people who value their blood so highly, they sure are willing to shed quite a lot of it. How many playgrounds do I need to turn into graveyards before the wicked bastards finally submit?" In January of 1968, England officially joined the Confederation of the Blood, leaving the Wotansloa, thus moving from a co-belligerent to an outright ally of Pazism. Iskland and Norland were taken aback by this, and though they didn't break off relations with the Confederation of the Blood, they did go generally quiet for the rest of the war. The reasoning for this was due to a vision that their Gothi, or High Priest, had experienced during a religious fervor. This prophecy was as follows. "The moon will turn to blood in the next cycle. Ymir's blood is the dark ocean. Kvasir's blood gives inspiration to men. Our people are covered in the blood of their sacrifices. It's all blood. It's all blood. Our southern neighbors are the men of blood, and to be their brothers is a matter of blood. Enter into the wisdom of the gods. It's all blood. It's all blood." He then promptly died. Norland and Iskland took this to mean that they should distance themselves from the Confederation of the Blood, believing their path leads to ruin, whereas England interpreted this to mean that they are implored to follow Avarignia towards the impending apotheosis of their blood, which all the legends of their people have been pointing towards. This wasn't simply a political schism, but a religious one as well, with England now following the Spamanlager branch and the others following the Gamal branch. Things then came to another halt as 1968 came to a close. Elsewhere, the world continued to solidify, and wars neared their natural ends. In Pangnan, Zaratherma declared wars of conquest against the rump states of Kaimur, Teresia, and Kalama. Without their colonial overlords in Nam Ning and Laizhou, they had been set adrift, and were thus vulnerable to attack. This war was a foregone conclusion, and the armies of the Praidu Laucum would become masters of the entire continent by 1970. The situation in Pang Bay was different, as Free Zaratherma found itself crushed up against three major powers. Of course, given their Evandra structure, random pirate bands raided and attacked these neighbors with reckless abandon, leading to a southerly assault from Avarignia in the north, cleaving all the way down the east coast by 1970. Though this also spurred Free Zaratherma to assault the capital islands, making some gain. Meanwhile, in the east, Poyang waged brutal war against their rebellious former subject, and the world's premier republic, Yorafen Kai. Yorafen Kai had performed quite well in the early days of the war, focusing on indirect engagements and island-hopping maneuvers to keep the pressure on Poyang while robbing them of a direct encounter. However, with less than a third of Poyang's total population, they couldn't keep this up for long, and by 1970 they were totally annexed by their former masters, the struggling flame of their experimental government extinguished forever. Truly, it had seemed as though the Great Lion of the East had finally emerged victorious from millennia of struggle towards ultimate victory. Perfect power. Unfortunately for them, the beleaguered, largely secular empire had a neighbor to the northeast which was intent on teaching them the fear of God. Though no war had blossomed between the two yet, it was only a matter of time. Would the ancient hegemon take its place on the throne of Asia? Or would the freshly fanatic warriors repel the Chinese, as they had done so long ago? Some context is required here. Japan had rapidly adopted the teachings of this new theological upstart as its very own. The Shinjitsu no Kyokai was wildly popular with the nation's military men, and rapidly overtook the manufactured and frankly ideologically weak Susanoo justification that the Blue Emperor had used to justify his rise to power all those years ago. Still, only about 30% of the nation's citizens attended church and took its teachings to heart, but this was enough. Those with a monopoly on force had found meaning and power in the words of this new version of an old faith, especially how it centered Japan as a cornerstone of holy belief and clearly delineated the nations of man as separate works of God. Indeed, while most of the common and middle-class subjects revered the ancient Shinto ways, they would have been banded about by whatever their superiors commanded of them, regardless of justification, so long as there was one. That justification had simply changed. Japan was now the land of God's chosen people, commissioned with the purpose of raining righteous fury down upon the continental apostates. Missionaries from the Shinjitsu no Kyokai were sent out to nations across the globe during this period, acting as neutral intermediaries, feeding the hungry, treating the sick, and consoling the dead. Over the course of the coming decades, this would proliferate Christianity in a wide yet shallow arc. For example, Avarignia, as with many other European nations, had a Christian population comprising roughly 30% of its population due to the period of Chinese colonialism. This was an uprooted version of the Ujou denomination, divorced from the inherent political implications which came with it from the East. As such, when a new denomination came to visit that had no ties to the Chinese powers or colonial ambitions, it was warmly adopted. Roughly 20% of those 30 converted, promptly scrapping the theological gymnastics associating Japan with some special purpose above the rest of the world. These independent national churches, with their very own councils of bishops, were called Natsisvanu. Eventually, as a result of slow but persistent proselytism, all European nations, save for those already Christian or Norse, now fostered a more sizable Christian minority, ranging from about 30% in places like Avarignia or Tribalia, down to 8% in places like Perugia or Box. Regardless, this process had only just begun in 1970, when the containment war thawed out, and front lines began to move again. By this point, rocket technology had proliferated between both sides of the conflict, utilized to devastating effect on both sides of the war. This innovation was what widely got the ball rolling again in terms of martial activity. Anti-air rocket systems had now largely protected cities across the Confederation of the Blood from the devastating air raids and the yet more ruinous nuclear bombs, which the Pact of Rome still required relatively slow-moving bombers to deliver. In fact, the Pact of Rome had 2 more nuclear bombs in their possession, but the air defenses made them doubt their chances of a successful run, putting research into affixing these payloads to long-range rockets as warheads, but the technology wasn't quite there yet. As a result, Avarignia and Burgundia were able to make further gains without fear of having to leave a sizable garrison at home, cleaving through Italia and Germania. Meanwhile, seeing the writing on the wall, the Northern League, an old alliance consisting of Perugia, Box, and Ordovicia, decided to make their move, declaring their own war against the Pact of Rome for fear of the position they would find themselves in if they did not take advantage of the opportunity before them. Thus, the Northern League became a co-belligerent of the Confederation of the Blood. This led to the complete partition of Germania by 1972 and the partition of Samogitia by 1973. This left only one nation left in the Pact of Rome, the most rabid, fanatical restorationists in the Alliance, and the only nuclear-armed state in the world. The Peninsular Advance, led by General Arnza Muthlicus, was carried out by a combined military force consisting of Avarignians, Tribalians, and Burgundians in equal measure. This campaign was a brutal one, as the Videntes had pulled out all the stops in order to claim as much blood as possible for the glory of their Roman idea. They caused rock slides, they filled the earth with landmines, they carried out poison gas attacks, they even took a page from Zarathermite history and utilized rabid animals against the invader. While it was a grinding advance, it was an advance nonetheless, and 2 years and 500,000 men later, the combined force finally laid siege to an exhausted Rome, which fell in a matter of months. General Director Poplicola was underground in his bunker when he triggered the launch of the first nuclear missile, though he was found out and filled with bullets before he could launch the second. This warhead sailed in a wide arc across Europe, aiming for Burgos and Avarignia, but failed to reach its intended target, instead falling into the western Mediterranean and detonating off the coast of the Balearic Islands, causing a massive fish die-off and blinding thousands of residents that lived on the unsuspecting islands. With this, the Containment War ended, with a whimper instead of a bang, and the Confederation of the Blood rose victorious from the ashes. The whole thing felt bizarrely conventional as the war eventually lost steam, dragging along to what felt like a natural victory by the end. Now, in 1975, the world felt as though it didn't know exactly what to do with itself, and there was a general lull of activity for a little while, during which the troops came home and people went back to their normal lives, if but for a time. This period was known as the Small Peace. Now, what exactly constituted normal life was different from place to place. Beginning with Zaratherma, life had never been exactly normal since the First Civil War. In free Zaratherma, there were really no rules governing the relations between people. Your average Zarathermite here was either living in service to one of the multitudinous pirate bands which effectively governed the country, or was a member of them. Things were uncertain from day to day, but there were no laws which you had to abide beyond whatever your local band foisted upon you, typically taxation in kind for labor or tangible goods instead of money. In short, it was a hard life, unless you were one of the pirates, and even then it wasn't exactly a luxurious life by any means. Though, of course, you weren't measured, tracked, recorded, lectured, or otherwise molded by society to be anything other than whatever you felt like being, which is a state of affairs that appealed to many kinds of people. Meanwhile, things were much more regular in the Kingdom of Zaratherma. Your average citizen still struggled, but they struggled in a largely agricultural economy, not one rooted in piracy, though that still played a role. There was even a growing middle class, plying their trade in things like law, carpentry, and medicine. Though, everybody was subject to the absolute rule of the Rex, who was currently waging an unending war against the unruly neighbors to the north. Random conscriptions were not uncommon. Back east, in the place Zarathermites often called the Old Country, the Ponzi government of Avarignia provided a unique quality of life to its people. First, it organized all of society along the harshly delineated lines of a racial caste system. For those at the top, they enjoyed the highest standards of living anywhere on Earth. They lived longer, they engaged in fulfilling work related to administration and high culture, they were awash with cash, and all of society was geared towards their benefit and success. They lived in cities which were beautiful and clean and orderly, featuring robust public transport and public services, alongside those in the middle of the caste system who also benefited from such public institutions. It must be said that this upper class, even with the inclusion of Avarignia's recent conquests, still accounted for a majority of the population. It was undeniable that Avarignians reaped immense benefits from the way society had been ordered in their favor. Then, those in the middle of the hierarchy, comprising broadly European non-Avarignians, while not recipients of the splendorous privileges afforded their betters, were still afforded a generous array of human rights, and could expect things like labor protections, state pensions, and economic mobility within their caste. However, for those at the bottom of the hierarchy, consisting of non-Europeans, political agitators, and moral degenerates, they faced the worst treatment of anybody on the face of the earth. They were consigned to slave labor camps, death camps, harvested for their organs, experimented on, and generally extracted for all their value before being sentenced to a terrible death. The rare instance of a higher skill victim saw them strung along on the bare minimum in order to execute their functions for as long as possible. Be that some artisanal skill useful to the war effort, dividing labor between camp residents, or some talent which proved entertaining to camp guards and administration, like music or parlor tricks. It cannot be overstated that the lives of regular people were the best they possibly could be, while the lives of those trod underfoot were horrific in the extreme. Some called this a society of contradictions, while others called it a price worth paying. This extended to all other member nations of the Confederation of the Blood, each centered around their own ethnicities. Again, moving east, Phrygia was a nation rebuilding. Spared the horrors of the Continental War, the broadly poor people were just happy to be free of philosophism, tending to their collective psychological scars. Most people were employed either in agriculture or massive public works projects headed by the military government, constructing things like bridges, roads, hospitals, schools, and defensive installments, especially along the border with Serbia, of whom the military was quite suspicious. Of course, those integrated into the fairly corrupt system of military power and influence lived better lives than the average person, having access to things like cars and single-family homes, but by and large they were fairly benign overlords, especially in comparison to the prior regime. Further east, the nations of the Desert Greeks scarcely had any regular people to speak of. Their societies were comprised of small cabals of ultra-rich elites who grew wealthy off of oil and weapons manufacturing, and who provided stipends and useless softball government jobs to its general population in order to keep them complacent and economically active. They imported almost everything, using their vast sums of money, oil, and weapons to obtain food, medical supplies, industrial components, and more. Those they did business with included Phrygia, the nations of the Northern League, and a great deal of African dictatorships, who were more than happy to work their people near to death in order to afford the guns of the Desert Greeks. Neighboring them, Rajasthan was a nation of stagnation. Partially industrialized, with a huge population divided between agricultural and spiritual endeavors, it has immense potential, but lacks sufficient power projection. Due in part to its unusual Mandean brand of Christianity, many people have decided to be religious ascetics, living in conditions of near wilderness, spending hours or days in meditative prayer neck-deep in rivers or atop mountains. These people are afforded societal protection, and as such are left to their devices. Since there are so many of them, the burden of their labor falls on the rest of society, especially farmers, who are often indentured to their fields by powerful rural landlords who own vast tracts of farmable earth. Further east, Poyang now resembled an earlier period of its own history, the Industrial Revolution. After the pain and humiliation of the post-colonial period, they had seen their industry and infrastructure wither, but now it was all coming back online, and they were experiencing an economic and population boom. The mineral and material value that recent conquests added to their economy was immense, and led to a general period of reindustrialization. Though, their society was decidedly unequal, with scores of desperately poor people languishing in their millions, while the rich grew exponentially richer, a holdover from the social systems of their slave economy, which was brought to a sudden stop centuries ago. Then, Japan represented a nation of moderation. It was still on a long curve of growth and development, with high standards of living and relatively low levels of poverty, while social and economic inequality were admittedly outsized. Those at the bottom didn't suffer the way they did in many other countries, and thus society as a whole was able to abide by the laws and commands of its elite. As a whole, society was harmonious, lacking both the highs and the lows which characterized the other nations of the world. The small peace would last 5 years, and during these 5 years, various things occurred. Globally, urbanization sped up as millions moved from the countryside into cities, especially in the east. Within the Confederation of the Blood, economic and scientific integration programs were carried out, and Avarignia even sought to utilize rocket technology to send a man to space, which they managed to do at the end of the Small Peace in 1980, making Lar Kalizna the first human to visit space. This technology was also stolen by the Kingdom of Zaratherma via the use of high-level espionage, which was in turn stolen by Free Zaratherma, who in turn sold it to places like Poyang and Japan. Another trend in relation to this would be the widespread proliferation of electronics, including a boom of consumer electronics. The Small Peace would earn its name as a result of another trend which took place during its historic arc: the expansion of Avarignian territory in Africa. In order to fuel its burgeoning consumer market, Avarignia would wind its way up the eastern coast of Africa, eventually running into Poyang, which had used the Andaman Islands as a launching-off point to do the same thing for the same reasons. The flashpoint came with the Horn Revolt, which consisted of Poyang colonizers whipping the locals up into a frenzy about the Avarignian approach, convincing them to break out in revolt and attack several major population centers on the Indian Ocean, launching their own naval invasion of Madagascar, cleaving 2/3 of the island out for themselves. At the same time, Japan requested membership in the Confederation of the Blood, providing genetic and archaeological documentation to back up their claim. Specifically, they focused on the ancient North Eurasians, who lived in northern Siberia between 20 and 25,000 years ago. These ancient North Eurasians were the direct ancestors of the Indo-Aryans who would go on to be the founding stock of many European races, and they were also direct ancestors of the Jomon, who make up a significant proportion of Japanese ancestry. The Japanese argued that this is borne out by the Japanese cultural distinctions to other Asians, like the Chinese, who lack North Eurasian ancestry, like a long-standing dog culture which never viewed them as livestock, as well as systems of feudal governance which broadly resembled certain European systems in an uncanny fashion. They also promised they would invade Poyang in exchange for membership. This caused a deep, violent divide in the Patsi military government between those who believed the Japanese claims and accepted them as fellow whites, those who weren't necessarily convinced but didn't want to pass up the military potential of such a deal, and those who wanted to reject their proposal on the face of it, given they have significant Asiatic ancestry. This split Avarignia's decision-making body, the High Military Council, nearly in half, between the pragmatists who wanted to accept the deal and the purists who fought to reject it. Ultimately, after months of deliberation, and yet more advances by Poyang against the Avarignian colonial presence in Africa, the Japanese were accepted into the Confederation of the Blood, given the status of noble foreigners, placing generally at the rank of Elvahus. This decision was only arrived at due to a hair's-width majority. The leader of the pragmatist cause was General Karkana himself, who established his position in a short statement which read, "We live in the most extraordinary of times. We found ourselves born in the fulcrum of history, that place where only great men are born, and a great decision has been laid at our feet. Though the Japanese only share in a modicum of our blood, it is undeniable that they take part in a civilized nobility which is more like our own than that of the savage races. In days like our own, we cannot deny the fellowship of a great nation in the East who will fight with us and bring our cause to victory against Poyang." Then, as promised, the Japanese launched a full-scale land and naval invasion of Poyang, engulfing the entire Pacific in the War of Eastern Finality. It was characterized both by its sheer magnitude and the rapidity of its combat. Military hardware had advanced at an exponential rate, with new planes, tanks, and ships revolutionizing warfare. In addition, Avarignia's general prohibition against nuclear weapons, which it was willing to lethally enforce, meant that conventional war stubbornly persisted between states. Due to the scientific and economic integration program, Japan gained access to cutting-edge Avarignian tech. For example, the Phasm Mark IV, a jet engine fighter plane boasting a 42-foot wingspan, a maximum speed of Mach 2.5, which is 1,650 miles per hour, and a host of armaments, including one body-mounted machine gun, one body-mounted shell cannon, 12 heat-seeking Fentor missiles, 2 Pumia laser-guided bombs, and 4 anti-tracking heat flare charges. This fighter was the finest thing to ever cut through the skies, and everybody knew it. And thus, armed in this way, the war raged. Japan also had the benefit of scores of volunteer divisions from the Confederation of the Blood, including men from Avarignia, England, and Tribalia. Combat on the ground was exemplified by the Battle of Black Dragon River. Poyang was defending a dam downstream in an adjoining military production town called Baogang. This place was heavily fortified, bristling with artillery and thousands of soldiers. These certainly secured the area, but they were distinctly out of date. Meanwhile, a combined Confederation force led by Japanese General Daigo Nakamura wound its way up the river, winning encounter after encounter until they found themselves within striking range of the city. For several days, fire was exchanged between the industrial center of Baogang and Confederation forces. However, the scales were tipped in the favor of the attackers when Poyang's helicopter defense perimeter was taken out by revolutionary surface-to-air missile systems, and a squadron of Phasm Mark IV aircraft carried out an airstrike against Baogang and its dam, flooding the city and killing thousands as the attackers tightened their noose around it. Poyang's defenses were robust, but for them, the war still came too early. Given that the general devastation of their most recent war outpaced the devastation of the Containment War, and faced with weapons which were insurmountably advanced, they crumbled, bit by bit. They were driven back in Africa, they were driven back in the Pacific, and they were driven back even in Asia. History had simply misaligned for Poyang, subject to history's finest curse. Bad timing. If this war had come even 5 years later, Poyang would have had a real fighting chance. It would have fully reindustrialized, it would have produced the military hardware needed for another war, it would have replenished its morale. But unfortunately for them, that didn't happen, and China burned. The flames could be seen on the horizon for uncounted miles, crackling in their terrible orange hue. General Nakamura, who was now a national hero and on track to become the next shogun, gave a short but impassioned speech on the shores of the Namning coast, Poyang's final holdout of resistance, saying, "History has witnessed here today not only the glory and magnificence of our people, but the glory and magnificence of the Christian God. The Chinese, despite being handed the truth of the Lord on a silver platter, turned from him, bowing down before the golden calf of their own personal glory. They gave themselves over to their repugnant nature as their venerable churches lay rotting, and so God put their cities to the torch and dashed their civilization against the rocks. We were chosen. As lightning in the east is visible even in the west, we are the people of the Lord." With the fall of Poyang in 1983, their resurgence cut savagely short, came the apotheosis of Japan, now the undisputed master of Asia. Then came the Big Peace, a period of time lasting from 1983 to 2003. Now, this is considered by many to be a misnomer, for two reasons. First, that this period of time isn't very long, and second, that conflict still occurred, but historians defend its use for two other reasons. First, it is not so much the length of the peace, but what happened during it that makes it big, and it serves as a useful device of contrast to the so-called small peace. At the start of the Big Peace in 1983, millions of Chinese fled into Urad and Mongolistan, triggering ethnic conflict and outright famine, causing the two to officially become failed states, vast tract of anarchy and warlordism from one horizon to the other, leading to Urad's conquest and Mongolistan's gradual hemming in by outside powers. One such Chinese warlord came to prominence in Mongolistan, calling himself Baihu Khan. He was characterized by a frothing hatred for Christianity, whose god he believed had abandoned him and laid his people low, instead worshipping Mogwai, the manifestation of evil and ancient enemy of God. His ultimate goal was to make it to the Holy Land in order to burn every church he found there and salt the earth. His band was called the Mogwai Clique. They were kept in check by the Knights of the Flame, who had no higher calling than to travel to the land where the Savior walked and defend it with their very lives. More nations were pressured to join the Confederation of the Blood from then on, adding nations newly christened as the Box Ethno-Republic, Parisian National State, and even the Norlandic Empire, all, of course, subject to territory renegotiation treaties as the price of entry, due to their failure to support the Confederation in either recent war. Technological progress was exponential throughout the Big Peace, perfecting sonar, information technology including the advent of the Overnet, a globe-spanning electronic communication and informational network, and the launching of the Glory Low Orbit Atmospheric Module, or GLOAM, in 1989. GLOAM hosted spacemen from across the Confederation, carrying out a variety of experiments, including plant life analysis, stellar observation, atmospheric testing, and life support research. It was on board the GLOAM that cryogenic life support was perfected in 1992, and the vacuum ion propulsion engine was invented in 1995, which uses the properties of ionic propulsion and the lack of drag in space to facilitate rapid travel through the vacuum of space. Of course, it was far below light speed, but it was regardless vastly more efficient as a source of propulsion than rocketry or jets of air. Soon thereafter, a team of men were on the moon, and in 2002 an automated rover began to construct the baseline construction pad for a permanent lunar base. Meanwhile, during the entire course of the Big Peace, the transatlantic war was characterized by totalizing Avarignian advances on all fronts, reducing both Xerothermas to ragged husks of their former glory. This era was capped off by the construction of a new capital city called Herma Resnea, meaning the place of the race. It was the greatest architectural marvel the world had ever seen, and was a fitting summary for the spirit of the age. Then, General Venix Carcana died on April 13, 2003, and there was a period of national mourning from Avarignians across the globe. Just as they viewed Simulci Indicida, who was now impossibly ancient to them, as the mother of their nation, they now viewed Venix Carcana as its venerable father. However, with him, his deciding vote on the Japanese question also died, and the purist faction gained power through the ascension of General Aranthor Tarna, who changed his official policy on the Japanese, expelling them from the Confederation of the Blood, and banning their spacemen from the globe. This led to a period of distinct tension between the two as they divvied up the rest of the world, called the Grey Peace, which lasted from 2003 to 2023. The Confederation of the Blood completed its conquest of Africa, as well as Iskland, Ordovicia, and much of Serdia, though it retreated from Confederation forces by way of cleaving through Phrygia in its own war, while the Confederation also took some Phrygian territory as well. Meanwhile, Japan invaded Rajasthan along with the Desert Greeks and took large chunks out of Mongolistan. Technological advancements continued to speed up, exponentially rocketing towards functions which once seemed preposterous. In 2019, life support systems and ion propulsion engines had reached such a point that so-called generation ships became feasible, the first of which, built in Avarignia and called the Pulumthessa, was stated to launch for Mars by 2030. Meanwhile, the permanent moon base, called Nova Iberia, had been settled in as a new fixture of the night sky, sparkling lights adorning the face of the moon like gemstones. Tensions continued to build until 2023, when Avarignia launched a kinetic bombardment satellite array, armed with tungsten rods which would deliver the potential force and kinetic power of a nuclear blast, without radioactive effects. As such, it skirted Avarignia's own prohibition on nuclear weapons, and the Japanese were given an ultimatum. As noble foreigners, they would not be subject to genocide, but Earth was to be the sole domain of the European races. The nation of Japan was to construct a fleet of generation ships and set sail for whichever star they so pleased. This was not simply a mercy, but an honor, a commendable recognition of racial mobility from one people to another. However, Japan did not see it that way. While they did commence their generation ship fleet, the first and largest of which was the Nakamura, they also triggered the Terran conflict, which consisted of all-out war between the Confederation of the Blood and the Japanese shogunate. In a final, desperate bid to prevent the kind of future which seemed almost certain, the remnant nations of the world, including Serdia, Phrygia, Alexandropon, and Transarabia, also threw their weight behind Japanese might, while the two Xerothermas made quiet gains against a distracted Avarignia. As such, the Confederation of the Blood unleashed stellar hell, carrying out dozens of kinetic bombardments against Japanese territories the world over. This war would rage for 20 years, until its ultimate conclusion in 2043. Notably, the Avarignians never struck the Japanese islands themselves. The Japanese had fought honorably, and claimed millions of lives in their defense, but nonetheless, they were duly defeated, and put the rest of their earthly treasure into the construction and launch of their great fleet, which set course for an undisclosed star somewhere far away. What took Avarignia by surprise, however, was when they saw two shoddy reproductions escape low Earth orbit as well, painted black and sporting bright white skulls. These were the Pridu and the Ukianthi respectively, the generation ships of both Free Zerotherma and the Kingdom of Zerotherma. They attempted to down these ships, but ultimately they managed to escape effective range before that could happen. As such, 2050 marked the year space was officially populated by various lineages from Earth, including pirates, the blood of the ancient and royal Indocchini line, a fanatically Christian Japanese shogunate, and of course the ultra-ethno-nationalist Confederation, which now lorded over the whole Earth, as it conquered all the remnant nations, including both Zerothermas. The ensuing years would proclaim the glory of the blood for which the Confederation was named, as genetic engineering eliminated genetic disease and extended lifespans to 150 years, the Great Genocide was declared officially completed in 2065, and methods of effectively faster-than-light wormhole travel began to be developed in 2081. In 2089, the Confederation of the Blood was reorganized, with non-Avarignian members becoming autonomous states beneath a united, global government, led by Avarignians as the first among equals. It was this truly global hegemony that would come to take hold of the solar system, and inevitably beyond. From a minuscule tribe at the edge of the world, Avarignia fought and persisted through the torturous millennia of blood and suffering to be delivered a deserving celestial throne at the edge of history itself. Truly, given this result, they saw their own claim as obviously, unassailably true. This was truly the finest race of man. Whatever the galaxy had waiting for them, there was no way it could measure up to these sailors of the seas and stars. Avarignia.